Hey everyone, welcome to Being Marketers Webcast. Welcome in, and hopefully you enjoyed our pre-show banter, if you enjoyed us or that. As everyone is coming in, we would love for you to share, if you have not already, share your definition of consciousness. So we're going to touch on consciousness as a topic today, and we're going to kick it around with our special, very special guests. But for you, what does consciousness mean? And I wrote a blog this week about consciousness and that it's not a buzzword. And I'm hoping that it doesn't become a buzzword. Even if it does become a buzzword, in the grander picture, it is not that. It is not a trend. It is something deep and forever, like an aquifer, something underground, something in the root system that supplies us all. Anyway, I've given my definition already, but I hope people, as you're joining, might jump in there and let us know what you think about consciousness.
Yeah, I was on my first Clubhouse last week, and I was asked, why do Americans commoditize like wisdom, like yoga's become, where it's commoditized now? And I said, that's because the United States, you either become a brand, you take a good idea and we turn it into a brand, or we turn it into a cult. Those are the two things. And so consciousness could go that route, which is why we have these kind of conversations, to keep it grounded and real and rooted in at least openness to what the definition is. So I like Stephanie's intentional awareness. That's good.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. I think too, the neat thing about a word like consciousness, a concept like it, is that it does evolve, right? Because as human beings, we evolve, societies evolve, cultures evolve, and so does this idea and the way it strikes us and the meaning we place upon it and live through it. So we have to stay in touch with that, with those ideas, so that they don't become staid, and we can keep them active in our lives and the way that we live. We're already going so deep today. So
right,
we'll just
right off the bat.
Okay, we got another consciousness definition here. The interplay between our actions, our environment, and others that should align with our inner wisdom, collective knowledge, and ideally uplifts us all to new levels of awareness.
She gets a brand new stove.
Yes. Gold star, Madeline. Awesome. Thank you. Yes, lots of love for that definition. So if you are just joining us, come on in. We are sharing definitions of consciousness as a precursor to our conversation with Tracy and Kelly, who I'll introduce in just a second. But I'll start off by just sharing a little bit about what brought us all here, which is BIMA, Being Marketers. So first off, I am Emily Sikorski. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Root and River, and I am joined by Justin, my other co-founder.
Hello.
And I will introduce our guests in just a second. But first, for those of you who may not know, Being Marketers is both a community and also just a series of conversations that we began having last spring, with marketing leaders. And in these conversations, we're really interested in picking our marketing leaders' brains on how they do their job, what do they think about marketing, trends, things that are happening in their world, and how they're using tools, how they're using philosophies of creativity, of teamwork, and of course of marketing and brand. But more than that, and I think most interestingly for me, we like to kind of dive into who they are as people and how they take care of the humans that are powering the brand. Because as you know, if you're familiar with Root and River at all, you are your brand, and it all begins inside of you in that internal system. So Being Marketers, that's what the webcasts are about. We have them every other month. They are open to all. So our next one will be in July, and we're going to have a great guest. And so you should invite people to come and listen in on the conversation and be a part of it. And if you're not doing that, we invite you to join our Being Marketers, or BIMA for short, because we like nicknames, our community, which is a collective of people who are inspired and seeking ways to ethically and soulfully brand and market. So in the community, we share ideas. Root and River gives some prompts. We have daily TPQs. We have weekly brand airs, which are these small little things that you can do to help improve your brand on a daily basis. So we invite you in to check out what Being Marketers is all about. And to find out more, you can go to rootandriver.com, click on Being Marketers, and you'll find all the details there. So with that being said, let's get into it. Oh, one last thing, or a little bit of housekeeping for today's conversation. So as we talk, please drop any questions or comments maybe you'd like us to speak to further into the chat box. We will pause about halfway through our discussion and we'll check in and see what's come up, because we don't want to wait to the end to have that back and forth. So please go ahead and do that as you go. I think Jen Lawhead, our chief of story, is listening in, and so she'll be keeping an eye out, as well as so will Justin and I as we go forward. Okay, let's talk about our guests. I'm really honored and thrilled to have Tracy and Kelly joining us today. Let's start with Kelly. So Kelly Campbell is a conscious leadership coach who helps creative and technology leaders really transform their lives and grow their agencies. So for 14 years, she led and owned a cause marketing agency. And while she was there, she really focused on these P's: personal development, purpose, positioning, people, pipeline, and profitability. Kelly is a keynote speaker at conferences across the country, both from her home and before the pandemic, actually going there. And she's been featured in the New York Times, a Woman Entrepreneur, a Startup on Medium, and Forbes. And she is a member of the Forbes Business Council, so she writes there regularly and participates. As she's currently authoring her first book on the prerequisites of leadership. That's good to know before you get yourself into a leadership position. And she's also the host of Thrive, which is a bi-weekly video podcast, which is sponsored by Work of a Jig, that really is centered on agency owners, helping them navigate personal and professional growth. Here's the connection between our two guests. She's also the co-founder of Consciousness Leaders with Tracy Yates, and they're going to be telling us more about that. But now I'm going to move over to Tracy. Tracy is also a celebrated speaker, marketer, a very innovative voice in the practical integration of intuition and spirit into everyday life, something she calls intuitive intelligence, which I love. She is modern seekers, people who are really seeking, as well as recovering type A's. So think about CEOs and leaders. They come to Tracy and her programs to help them reframe the unproductive patterns they've fallen into and really awaken and connect to their intuition and put it into practice. So for over 2 decades, in addition to all this, she's the founder and CEO of an award-winning marketing agency and has worked with some of the world's most influential brands: Google, Amazon, AT&T, Hulu, big names here, people. She's got some amazing experience there. And she and Kelly founded Consciousness Leaders recently, which is a global curated collective of conscious experts to guide evolving organizations. Was it in April, beginning of April? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah. April 1st, I think we launched.
So it's brand new. It's a newborn. So welcome, Kelly and Tracy.
Thanks for having us.
We're so pleased you're here. And so pleased everybody's joined us. So we like to go deep, as you know, in our conversation. So I want to start out by asking you both. In our prep conversation to this, we discussed what marketing has really come to mean. And Tracy, you shared that you saw marketing these days as a necessary evil. Kelly, you shared that you're seeing that marketing is really lacking humanity. I'd love for you both to kind of speak to those ideas. So we'll start with Kelly.
Yeah. So again, thanks for having us. We love talking to you guys, whether it's on Zoom, on a webinar, or, just chatting. So marketing. Yeah. It's, I think it's lacking humanity. It's evolved to the point where it isn't what it was set out to do, right? Like marketing was supposed to kind of highlight the pain points that someone was going through or an organization was going through, and then explain how a solution or a product or a service could solve that. And I think what's happened is that it's really become this game, right? Where people are sort of jockeying for positioning, and they're buying fake followers, and they're doing all of these like unethical, kind of immoral tactics that, and again, not everyone, but the bad marketing is what we're talking about here. I think it's just become such the norm to kind of hack into how you can get ahead of your competition and how you can crush it and make 7 figures in 30 days. And it's just, none of it speaks to humanity. So I'm kind of done with it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Wow. That's quite a statement from you, given that I like just read that bio, and it's just, but it's so fatiguing, right? It's so tiring.
I
Kind of
just think
being on
there's no intention, like having intention and integrity
Mhm.
and inside of marketing to me seems like almost oxymoronic at this point.
Definitely. Well, that kind of ties into Tracy, what you said about it being a necessary evil. Do you care to elaborate on that?
Yeah, and Madeline's like going off in the chat right now, so she can't come through the Zoom and get us, I think. But at the end of the day, I think we're talking about current marketing, right? As Kelly said, we're not talking about all marketing, and marketing is necessary, right? It's necessary to be visible, but at the end of the day, my belief is actually where the North Star starts, right? So there are icky tactics, right? And that's one of the reasons, quite honestly, why we're so bombarded and it's so hard to actually get people's attention. Yes, they're bombarded, but it's also because everyone's using the same tactics, right? And people can see through it. So to me, it really starts from what is the North Star? And generally, the North Star is we got to sell more of X, right? And I'm not quite sure that's the way to authentically market. And that's why I feel like right now it's a necessary evil.
Yeah, I think, both of those I felt a while, way before my pre-Emily days, when I'm an accidental brander. I was a corporate sales guy that started a company with some other marketers. And I just started looking at the way things were being done. This is back in 2003 and 4. And the first thing I noticed is that people that were in marketing seemed very out of touch with where money comes from. Mm-hmm. That the whole point of marketing is to generate sales. I mean, and you want to do that ethically, of course, but that's the point. It's not about just brand awareness or winning an Addy, or something like that. It's somewhat irrelevant. And what struck me about this topic of consciousness and marketing, everything is if we look at it at a macro level, the higher your consciousness, the more you raise your consciousness, the more obsolete old tools become. And so it's really a matter of what are the tools that we need to use as marketers and branders that are more in alignment with consciousness. And one I would throw out is storytelling. Mm-hmm. Storytelling will always be probably the most powerful. Storytelling and word of mouth, which are kind of hand in hand. Always relevant. It's like a black suit with a white shirt and a black tie. It will always be cool. Storytelling will always be cool as a consciousness tool. But a lot of the other stuff is either commoditized or it's manipulative or both.
It's so interesting because, and Kelly mentioned it too, is, and I see a lot of this on Instagram, is, all these coaches, right? Life coaches and consciousness coaches. But, they're talking about is like making 6 figures in X amount of time. And, I started seeing a lot of this, right? Just more and more and more. And I was like, wait a second, you don't think people can see through this? So I think it's just also going back to the lack of authenticity, right? And so anyway, yeah, it's just, hopefully, like you said, it won't become commoditized.
Yeah. I want to build on something that Justin said, actually, because when you talked about storytelling, right? Like what you're actually saying in that is storytelling really is authentic marketing, right? Because if you're telling the story, you're telling the story of like the founder of a brand or what life events or things that have happened to that person brought them to this moment or brought them to this idea that there was this gap in the market that they needed to fill. Or they wanted to serve a particular audience, right? So that story of the founder or the leader or the owner of the organization becomes then the brand narrative for the company. And that essentially is storytelling. But for me, I would consider that conscious marketing, right? I mean, this is all what this conversation is about. But most people don't look at it like that. They look at it like, well, who are our buyer personas, which is important. How can we market them? How can we create resonant language for them? I do all of this stuff. So it's not that I don't believe in it. Like we do need it, back to the necessary evil. But there's this, I think, historical lack of genuine authenticity in that, right? Like in those stories and as part of that narrative. So, I mean, that's what you guys do. You guys are the experts on that.
Well, I want to jump in there because I think this is a question that I have for both of you. Tracy, you talked about having that North Star, and Kelly, just talking about authenticity and how that can really help guide an entire brand. But for each of you as individuals, you've been leaders of agencies, you've created work, you've done marketing. How do you, what's one thing that you can share with our audience that keeps you rooted in your authenticity? Like, what's the balance point, or what's something that you have tried to center on or came back to when you found yourself sort of getting further from your root system, as we would say?
That's a really interesting question. Do you
Yeah.
want to go first?
Okay.
Or
I'm trying to think. No, I'm just trying to. So, I mean, I've always felt that from my own personal values, I've always been connected to them. And the work that I did, I never felt that I stepped away from them. But I think, when working with clients and I work with big corporations, right? Big brands. I've always found, and this authentically just works for me, is that when I do have an authentic conversation with my client, and I really share, well, this is the why, this is the thinking behind it, this is why strategically it makes the most sense. And when I come at it from an authentic place, rather than a place of trying to selling, it actually gets heard right away and it feels very natural. So that's how I approach it.
Yeah. For me, I think it was a little bit more personal. When I first started my cause marketing firm, I was really young. I was like 22 years old. I had just come out. I was kind of like feeling my own skin, my own comfort level and all of that. And I had a client early on who made it very clear that if I wanted to be in the business world, that I should probably dress a little bit differently, maybe not be so obvious. I have tattoos, right? So like maybe I might want to cover those. And so, from the very beginning, that felt so violating for me to be forced into a situation where I couldn't be myself. I couldn't have my own self-expression. And so I remember driving away from that meeting, which I did get the client, by the way, but I remember driving away from that meeting thinking to myself, I will never again try to wear a blazer in order to cover my tattoos. I will never take my eyebrow ring out again. I will never try to fit into a mold that didn't feel right, because I can get the client either way. And on top of that, if there's a client who doesn't want to work with me because of who I am authentically, and my comfort level with that, then that's clearly not an ideal client for me. And I have sort of stuck by that for the rest of my career. And it's the one thing I can look back on and actually thank that person for sort of highlighting that for me. And interestingly and ironically, they were a client all 14 years I had the agency. They were one of my very first clients. And when I sold the agency, they were one of the clients that transitioned over to the acquiring company. So yeah, it's...
Well, you touch on something there, Kelly, that I think is huge because, well, most unethical behavior, I would say maybe 90% of unethical behavior is a survival response. So you go back to sort of the anthropological view of, why people do unethical things. It's usually because they're in some deep state of scarcity. Well, I think what produces that is that everyone's being told that you have to be something other than you are. And sometimes it's like, well, we want to be the Uber of toothbrushes, or something like that. Like it's that kind of identity crisis where they don't really know who they are. So you pick a brand but it's deeper than that, down to the personal identity of who you are. And so I love the story that you told of the fact that it awakened this awareness in you that you're not going to do that. And then it informed your behavior, because now whatever you're doing for marketing is always about being who you really are, being who you truly are. And, we have this phrase as our root belief: all great brands are spiritual experiences. And we often, when we get into, the ebb and flow of entrepreneurism and everything, the thing that Emily and I say to each other is we're doubling down. Let's double down on spiritual, Because as soon as you start to drift into, well, let's let the market define what we are,
Right.
you've lost your way.
Yeah.
So that's a beautiful story.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think, that brings up a good point. I think we're in times right now that are so volatile and so dynamic, and we've experienced so much change that is still going on. So there are a lot of brands that are coming into this space. And I think for the first part of the pandemic and the lockdown, they were really just shutting down things like marketing. They were shutting down communication because of fear of what to say. And now we're seeing, particularly with some political brands kind of getting involved even more politically, new brands becoming politically active. So we're seeing people and brands venturing out and being part of what's going on in the culture. And then we see other brands sort of pulling away. So I'm very curious to hear from both of you how you see these cultural shifts impacting brands. And then, the good, the bad, the ugly of how you see brands doing this. And what can you share with our audience about how to maybe go about engaging that way? And what are you seeing that concerns you, excites you, what have you?
Yeah, so there's two things that I would highlight as like examples of companies that I think are doing this right and companies that are clearly doing this wrong right now, very recently. So, as people kind of start to return to the workplace, there's all this question mark around how is HR going to deal with fielding questions around vaccine status and policies around that. And a lot of employees and employers are worried about the implications of all of that. And one of the things that I saw GM do recently, which I thought was brilliant, was basically they came out with a very simplistic message: work appropriately. And what they meant by that was, I mean, they didn't say it in so many words, but what they meant by that, if you extend that conversation and really, understand what is behind it, they're valuing their employees. They're treating them like adults. They're treating them like humans. And they're saying, look at the situation, assess it for yourself. If you feel more comfortable working from home, if you feel comfortable going into the office, if, you want to wear a mask because of who else is going to be in the office that day, whatever the situation is, work appropriately for you and the other people for the greater good of all of us. That's really what that meant. And for me, that is sort of the sign of conscious leadership. I love this idea of treating our employees like adults. We don't have to be so rigid and so defined and so fear-based when it comes to policies. On the flip side of that, you see what happened with Basecamp recently, right? So Basecamp, the founders, who happen to be cisgender white males, they thought it was totally appropriate to say, we're bowing out of the conversation to the point where we're banning these conversations, political, social, all of that, in our workplace, on our channels. And there are lots of other things that are coming out about that, but disbanding a diversity, equity, and inclusion group that was forming internally, removing health benefits and just giving people cash instead because it's not their job to care for their employees. There's what I see that as is going directly against the grain of this shift that is just has so much momentum. It's really hard to be on LinkedIn or actually anywhere online and not run into this conversation where employers realize that it is absolutely their responsibility to have these uncomfortable conversations, to create safe spaces for their employees, to lean into giving them the benefits and the support for their well-being. I mean, on and on and on. So I think that that's kind of the future. And companies like Basecamp, the proof is in the pudding. The last time I checked a couple of days ago, a third of their employees had just completely given notice. So these are the implications. You don't actually have an option not to do the right thing anymore.
Yeah. Tracy, you've worked with very big brands that I listed in your intro. What's your experience inside of those organizations, or working alongside them and their approaches, and what do you see happening? How do you see a brand continuing to be relevant and part of those essential conversations?
Yeah, I mean, to add on to what Kelly was mentioning, I also see it as, and I don't even have a better word for it, but as taking a more humane approach, right? And looking at what truly is valuable to people, right? The folks who work for you, because, a brand doesn't exist without its customers and without its people, right? And I think that that's a little skewed for the most part. I don't think a lot of big corporations necessarily think that way. So I think it's about being more humane, and valuing things that are important to people. Bumble just, I think this was a few days ago, they announced that they are giving all their employees a week's of vacation. They're actually closing their business. So no business is going to be done for an entire week. Everyone's being paid, right? And so it's also those kind of things. And I think, to Kelly's point, the more that this becomes apparent that this is actually where things are leading, this is where things are headed, actually it's going to be even more difficult for brands who don't get on board to attract talent, because those folks are going to go to other places where, the things that are important to them and valuable to them are valued. It's not just about like the free lunch anymore, and
tables,
your free transportation with Wi-Fi so you can keep working, so it's just becoming more and more obvious and apparent.
Yeah. So a question for both of you, either of you go first, whichever, is what do you think is the temperament now towards the concept of consciousness in business? What's the general reaction that you get when you go out and talk about consciousness and just your regular everyday corporate executive? How do they respond? And kind of a second part to that question is, when they don't get it, what are they missing? What are they not seeing?
Yeah, I'll go first. Because that's what I do all day, right? I talk about consciousness, I talk about intuition, and I think, we all had a conversation a couple weeks back, and I was like, I think I said something like, I'm the least woo-woo person on the call, right? But, and so I think the problem is there's just a complete misunderstanding. There's a lack of education. That's what I see the issue is, because I believe that the majority of people want to do good. They want to contribute. They want to do good for others. They want to empower others. I don't think that's an unnatural state, not being in that state. So I think, to me, when I see that, I find it to be a lack of education. And so I generally will start there to help get people, closer to my side, if you will.
Yeah. And from my end, I would say that I don't get so much pushback on or question about what does that mean. They're just like, yeah, that makes sense, right? Tell me how it's good for business from a bottom line standpoint. Like, because I agree with you. Like, yeah, we should treat our employees well. We should do all these things. Like, yes, yes, yes. What they're not thinking about, or what they're thinking about incorrectly, is that this is not a box checking exercise.
Yes.
And this certainly is not a profit first thought process. If you think about the idea of money following value, you realize that profitability is a lagging indicator, right? So just like you wouldn't have this idea that you wanted to lose weight and you'd step on the scale every day and look at the number and wonder, like, why is the number not going down since I'm, especially if I'm not taking any action, right? Like, there has to be an action that is taken. And for me, the action that's taken is to value your employees, to really, to use your word from before, double down on this idea of supporting them in all of the ways that they need support, financially, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. I mean, you name it. Then they will stay longer. Their work will be better. the clients will stay longer. The clients will then expand their contracts, like on and on and on. You see this whole entire value circle where if you double down on investing in your people, it naturally will follow that all of the other things lead to a healthier bottom line. And that's what is not clicking in for some reason with a lot, I won't say all, but a lot of corporate leaders.
Well, it's scary, right? It's scary to completely flip it on its other side, right?
I mean, and it's counterintuitive, right? What do you mean I increase my expenses and my profits go up?
Yes.
Right.
And it's to me, and this is kind of where when I have these conversations with people, entrepreneurs and corporate people, is the consciousness, you have to attach it to an existing idea they already know. This is it can't be a brand new idea where there's no file folder. And so the idea that they already know is performance and productivity. Mm-hmm. Consciousness is the new, air quote, productivity. It's flow state. It's the Stephen Kotler, Joe Dispenza stuff. It's flow state. And imagine, I had this conversation with someone the other day who's somewhat of a skeptic around consciousness in business, not anti, but skeptical. Uh-huh. As I said, can you do anything to be more productive? Americans are the most productive workers in the world. We also have the least job satisfaction of any of the developed nations. So imagine if people were had more consciousness, and consciousness was encouraged and nurtured, that the productivity and the performance level would exponentially increase, and it becomes a competitive advantage, just like you see in high performance situations like sports or special operations in the military, or neonatal surgeons, people that are doing like really intense shit, that flow state that they can get into. Imagine doing that collectively as an organization. And I don't know of anyone that kind of has made that full on connection between like performance and consciousness, and how they are interwoven.
Well, I think too, and it goes back to the education, is that, when you talk about consciousness, and we ask this to people on the call when they first join, well, what does that really mean, right? And so I think at the end of the day, it's really understanding that consciousness actually is our natural state. We've been programmed and conditioned not to be in that state, right? And so it is, I see it as really as a reprogramming, like the unlearning and relearning, however you want to talk about it. And that can be big, right? That can be a big undertaking if you don't understand it. So I think, consciousness is really our natural state. And that's honestly where, and I'll get a little woo for a second, but that's really where manifesting works too, right? And at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about, right? The flow state and being able to manifest, and hyper productive, hyper creative. So it's all intertwined.
Yeah. The other thing that you can say from an application standpoint that corporations are leaning into right now because of social and market pressure is that they're bringing in a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants, right? Because what we want at work is belonging. And so, you have a situation where talk about unlearning, right? Like there's systemic racism inside of organizations, because organizations are comprised of people, and people of all different ethnicities and colors of bodies and all of that, right? So they're leaning into this idea, and they're realizing that, oh, wait a minute, a 45-minute workshop isn't going to cut it, right? So they're leaning in to realize, not only is that like counterintuitive, it's actually not what our employees want. Our employees do want an ongoing commitment to unlearning, to being re-educated in a way that kind of goes against our cultural norms that have been going on for well over 400 years. So yes, it is hard work, right? Like it's a commitment, there's dedication, but it's also possible, because what you see on the flip side of it, to use your point before, Justin, about using corporate language, is that you're seeing organizations who are experiencing way more collaborative conversations, way more open dialogue, way more innovation and creativity in their organizations. You could also call that productivity or performance, right? So they're realizing all of these benefits by doubling down into making sure that all of the people on their teams are feeling seen, heard, understood, and valued.
I think another element that we're all sort of weaving through, but I just love to point to, is the element of time. That these approaches take time. They are nurturing approaches, and you know, they're more of a feminine approach in that this is something that we are going to work on. We're going to dedicate ourselves to. So in America, we want results yesterday, right? We want to know that this strategy is going to pay off for tomorrow's bills that are due, and for the growth that I need to deliver to my shareholders next quarter. And that's not always possible. So it is challenging there. And I think that's where you get a lot of pushback. But even I think there's a fallacy in there too, because in a lot of cases, other tactics or approaches, strategies, they take time as well. But there's a lot more, let's say, packaging around the idea that they're going to be immediate and or really data driven, and that makes a lot of people feel justified in their resistance to something that is going to be more time, take more time.
When we built you know, we built this economic engine, you know, that is the founder of Whole Foods, whose name escapes me, John Mackey, thank you. He talks about this, that, you know, we built this machine, the system that has done much good in the world. Global poverty has shrunk, and opportunity, and it's not evil capitalism only. There's a conscious capitalism version of it. And I think what is happening though is that companies are understanding that this model that was built off of time, to your point, Em, is in conflict with what consciousness is, which is energy. And if you put it in some of the like meta terms, so like Chronos versus Kairos. Chronos time is human-made time. Kairos is nature-made or God-made time. And consciousness operates way more in Kairos time than Chronos time. But you think about the systems that are already in place. This is why I said your level of your systems need to reflect your level of consciousness. Because if you're trying to use old systems like time management and be more conscious, when it's really energy management, you're just asking for some more suffering.
Right. That's a really good point. I like that.
I said we would stop about halfway through and just check in with chat and check out any comments or questions. So if you do have something that came up, definitely drop it in there. In the meantime, Madeline, earlier when we were talking about the necessary evil of marketing, she pointed out that the key word there is tactics. And she is arguing that is not necessarily marketing. It's garbage is what she said. So either of you like to comment on that, or any thoughts that brings up for you?
Yeah, Stephanie just said it's manipulation, right? Like that's exactly what it is. It's manipulating the minds of the people who you want to convince them or to persuade them to purchase your product. And I guess from my standpoint, it's not about manipulation or convincing or persuading anyone. If you have a message that resonates clearly with someone and immediately because it is authentic and it solves a pain point or a need or something that they have, there's not much marketing from a tactical standpoint that you have to do. Like, yes, you have to get it in front of them, but you know, from that standpoint, it's not about these kind of like stickers of like 7 figures in 30 days and you know all this language that is, like, to your point before, Emily, like super masculine, and to the point where it's like toxic from a masculine energy standpoint. We don't have to do that. There is definitely another way. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as coercion. Kelly was a little bit nicer how she said it, but I just think of it as coercion. And I don't know anybody who wants to be coerced into anything. Right. So, and I think we had talked about it, a couple of days ago about marketing and actually it being more of an invitation, right? So I know we'll talk about that, but at the end of the day, people don't want that kind of messaging. They don't want to be told what to do. I think that they want to be given an invitation to explore, to engage, to have a journey, to get to know someone, and that's that's authentic.
Yeah. And that flips into another comment about marketing really being an ongoing conversation with your audience. And I love that framing. It kind of goes to that prior conversation we had about invitation that we'll get into. Also, we're seeing a bunch of brand new brands being born during the pandemic, which is exciting. And that's something I'm definitely interested to see, how new players, how new entrepreneurs or founders kind of begin here. And that kind of leads into our next question. You both founded and grown very successful agencies, but let's say the slate was clear and you were going to start, I know you just started Consciousness Leaders, but you were going to start an agency today. What would you change? What would you do differently? Or what would you set out in a different way than maybe you did before? And we'll start with Tracy.
Well, in my industry specifically, in marketing, it's hyper competitive, right? It is. There's RFPs where you share the whole entire creative strategy and design, and it's not just like
for free.
And it's out to multiple agencies. So it just how it's being, how the way it's working and the current way it's working is just, it breeds this super competitive scarcity mindset. And I just wouldn't do it anymore. I just wouldn't play in that world. I would do something different. I would be very, very specific about the brands and the brand's culture and what their mission and values are, that it aligned with what my mission and values are and the work I wanted to do. Because again, at the end of the day, when those two things come together naturally, that's when you do the best work and have the best outcome. So
for sure. When you were talking, I was thinking instead of RFP, you could do an RFC, like request for client. This is who we're looking for. And you don't have to give us, everything either. How do you undo and come up with new systems? I think that's what's exciting about this new time, and founders who are going to come in with a totally different level set, so to speak, of what they're looking for. What about you, Kelly? What would you change from what you did before? How would you?
So I actually get asked this question quite a lot from clients and from other people. And they always say, if you had to do it all over again and start your agency from scratch, what would you do differently? And funny enough, and you guys don't even know this, but funny enough, I always say, if I was going to start another agency, my positioning would actually be really, really close to Root and River. Mm-hmm. Because for me, it's the most resonant, right? Like, if I'm going to lean in, I'm going to lean in all the way to say the only people that I want to work with are not afraid from using the word spiritual, or they're not afraid from being really who they are, right? Like putting that right into their marketing or their web copy, their positioning statements, like all of those things. I think it takes a level of courage and a level of bravery that I would only want to work with those people. So, yeah. And I have actually, named you guys in that because you're one of the only companies, honestly, and I work with tons of agencies, you're one of the only ones who I think is really, really doubling down on that. There are maybe a couple of other ones, but not pushing in and leaning in and using that messaging to the strength level that you guys are. So yeah, I would.
That's very affirming. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Wow. Give me the tingles. Yeah. And so someone's listening to this or watching this and they're like, all right, I get it. I want to be a conscious marketer, whether they're in marketing or they're a solo entrepreneur, or whatever. So they're committing. What are 2 or 3 things that both of you, all of you, I'd love to hear from you too on this question, Em. What are 2 or 3 standards or must-dos or must-haves that are like, all right, you want to be a conscious marketer, you need to do these 3 or 2 things, 2 or 3 things. What would you say to that?
I'll throw one out there to start. I would say that if you're not in 100% integrity and always coming back and using your core values as your sort of checks and balances, then you're probably not doing things the right way. So being in integrity, like fully, I don't mean just mostly, I mean fully in integrity, and then coming back to those core values, checking every single thing about against those core values. To me, that would be a conscious decision, conscious marketing.
I would say, on top of that, I would say empathy. And empathy is a bit different than compassion, right? But coming from a place of openness, being able to hear, being able to take in information that's being shared with you, whether you necessarily agree with it or not. That to me is a sign of a conscious leader, is empathy. And you know, I've seen people that I've worked with where they become such great leaders. They were already great leaders. They've become such better, greater, I don't know what, amazing leaders, because they've changed so much themselves, and they can bring their full self, authentic self to work. And it's organically just gets passed off to everybody around you. Like you don't even have to try. So anyway, so I would say empathy.
Right.
A good one.
You say
Two popped up for me. One of them is one of our Written River standards, which is find the flow and F the formula. So if you're going into this, you have to be able to tap into your inner wisdom, and that doesn't mean that the outer pressures or resistance goes away. The formulas will always lure you in because they're seductive and like they look easy and pretty, but you have to really continually, as a practice, tap into that inner, find the flow of it, find the flow of the client. You know, even when you're doing your work, you feel pulled in a strange direction, like follow it. Try not to talk yourself out of those instincts is one of them. The other one for me is wholeness, as in like, you know, some days you're going to be off, and that's just as relevant to the conversations you're trying to have with your audience as the on. So show the world both.
Yeah, I think I love all of those. I would add that consciousness as a practice begins with yourself. And so not having a contemplative practice, even if it's 2 minutes of meditation and a couple of bullets in a journal, to try to be a conscious marketer, a conscious entrepreneur without doing the inner work yourself is it's going to just make it much more difficult, maybe even impossible. And then anything, to me, anything that would cause you to drift from your core self, so that's a mindset thing, primarily related to your own worthiness. I struggle with this a lot. I struggle with still, you know, I'm sort of wired for threat and conditioned by trauma. And when you're wired for threat and conditioned by trauma, consciousness is a threat unto itself, because you realize that none of this shit really matters, that I think is important because of those two things. And so I have a tendency to, you know, if there's a great temptation to go over into that side of manipulation, because your ego mind justifies it because we got to eat. And I have to be able to consciously step back and go, operating in integrity. I think Kelly, I don't know if that was your exact word, but operating in that space of integrity is, you can't really mix consciousness and deceit, not for very long. And a lot of that starts with believing my own bullshit stories, you know, like related to unworthiness or lack of value, or nobody cares about any of this stuff. And that's consciousness is this essentially a constant a constant tool for battling you know, trauma responses that many of us have. Yeah. So
what I also hear you saying in that, which definitely resonates with me, is that in order to be a conscious marketer, you have to be a healing leader.
Right.
There's a component of healing, self-healing in this.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
I think that's a conversation that's hopefully going to be coming up more and more. We mentioned like Oprah just has a book out that talks a little bit about that. I think it just hit the #1 bestseller list today. So yeah, there's a lot to this. This is juicy.
It is. Speaking of consciousness and speaking of consciousness leaders, you both founded this. You came together. You've actually still never met in person, right? This is just coastal via
Bi-coastal.
Zoom. Yeah. So you have obviously the power of this idea of consciousness leaders. Share a little bit about that spark. If you'll like take us inside of like, when was the moment where you're like, yeah, let's do this? Because I always love to hear that story. And then share maybe a little bit of the vision so that our audience can understand what it is all about.
Yeah,
Okay.
you want me to take the first part and you
I
take
was going to say, I'll
vision?
take the first
Okay,
part.
great. Go for it. Do it.
So Kelly and I, we've known each other, maybe at least 2 to 3.
Something
Yeah,
like that.
some 2 to 3. I'm not exactly sure. Anyway, we first met because Kelly and I were working together when she was an agency coach for me, for my marketing agency. So that's how we originally got together. And I think we worked together in that role for about a year.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of working together, I was kind of like, I'm not really sure I want to do this anymore. So I, my brain was already there, and just then kind of trying to figure out like what it looked like. So I think, right, like maybe early 2020, Kelly and I were talking, and I was like, so, I'm thinking about doing this, and
you were starting the new
I was
coaching
starting
and consultancy.
Yeah, starting Mindway, and I was like, so, but I think there's something. And she was like, are you going to say corporate America? And I was like, yeah. So that's how it all came together. And we did try to meet in person once in New York, but it just didn't happen. So we've tried. It just hasn't come together.
Yeah. And just to kind of build on that, it was, I guess it was just like thinking about things around the same time. And you just have that like spark of conversation where I had been looking at what was kind of happening in the world, obviously like midst of the pandemic, the George Floyd murder had just happened. I sort of already saw as a ripple effect of that, what would happen from the standpoint of that reaching corporations and them finally looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and even sustainability and all of their lack of consciousness in their business realms needing to change, right? Like systemically. And so, this idea of creating something that was a collective of experts who had all of this different nuanced expertise around the things that we're talking about here, creating that collective and essentially filling a gap in the market, right? Because we all love Google. It's actually how Tracy and I met. She ran a Google search and there I was. And so we know that people use Google to find things like diversity and inclusion consultant near me. The problem is that Google doesn't vet that information, right? And it's then on the shoulders of the HR people and other people who are running those searches to figure out like, well, who do I need? Who do I trust? All of these different things. So there's lots and lots of pain points around this. And then back to what we said earlier, there's a mindset of like, we need to just check a box and have a 45-minute workshop about, how we can unlearn racism in our organization, which clearly is not how you do that. So there's a little bit of education that's happening. There's a lot of employees internally who are speaking up and saying, I want to be valued. I want to be seen. I want to be heard. I want to be supported. And then there are people from the standpoint of sustainability and climate change who are saying, as a consumers, you can't continue to operate this way, right? Like, I'm not going to buy your products if you don't care about the environment, because it impacts everyone. So if you just want to boil it down to like caring about people and caring about the planet, organizations, we're talking about corporate here, but organizations need to step up. And so we have this collective that has a group of experts that can help organizations with that. And we've gone through the process of finding them from across the globe, vetting them, bringing them onto the platform, and facilitating collaboration between them so that they can do their work in the business world and beyond. So yeah, that's kind of the vision. It's really just to raise the collective consciousness and raise the visibility of all of these people so that we can create a more harmonious world. That's what it's all about.
We can contribute to, you know, what we were talking about today, right? Through this, through consciousness leaders. And yeah, full disclosure, Root and River, Justin and I, we are part of it. We're so
founding
members. So happy to be
you're part of the first 30 who are on the site.
Oh, it's just a total honor to be in their company. These are some incredible people. If you're listening in, you should go to the website, just check them out. Like you can do searches and see all the areas of expertise where they hail from across the globe. It's really amazing what you have so thoughtfully and intentionally put together. And I honor you both. I'm grateful to you both for doing that work for us, for the world.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I have a I guess would be a wrap question that wasn't in any of our prep stuff. So I'm coming in with something surprising here. What do you struggle with related to consciousness yourself? What's an area where you're like, man, I'm always fighting this demon? What would that be?
For me, it's committing to, I love the word that you used, practice before, specifically a contemplative practice. I do have a Buddhist psychology and contemplative science coach that I've been working with for many years. But the struggle for me, I wouldn't call it a demon. It's the struggle for me is like committing to the daily practice of that.
Thank you for sharing that. Tracy?
Well, I have a pretty strong practice. I mean, I work with, clients every day around this. So I'm pretty much in it all day long. But I think the challenge that I have is having patience, and it's about having patience for a large percentage of the people to kind of get on board with us, I think. And I have to check myself because I really try not to get preachy and be in my soapbox. And I focus on being open and really hearing all, meeting people where they are. But at the end of the day, I'm impatient. So that's what I struggle with.
How about you, Em?
I think I was just thinking that my emotions are a great strength of mine, but sometimes they get in the way of conscious practice, just the discipline of it. I just will feel something and kind of get shifted away from the practice. Whether that, for me, that's writing and meditation, and also movement for me. So yeah, I have to come back to center and become more of an observer, but I struggle with that.
All three of those resonate with me. I would say that mine is threat sensitivity, which often shows up as negativity. Even if I pretend to be optimistic, in my head, I'm like, this is going right in the shitter, like super negative. I mean, I remember every 6 months or so, but certainly at the end of the year, Emily and I, we do a partner retreat, and we ask two questions, which is, do you want to keep doing this? And the second question that we ask is, how can I be a better partner? And at the end of 2019, on a hike in Austin, Emily was in town here in Austin. She said, I asked that question. She said, you could be a lot less negative. And I still struggle with it. And negativity seems quite incompatible with consciousness to some extent. So anyway, that's mine.
I'm gonna follow up with you offline about that. I'm really curious about that.
All right, deal.
I actually said that to him a year earlier than.
But that's the lagging indicator.
Probably that amount of time for
Tracy talked about, I think it was Tracy that talked about profit as the lagging indicator, or I can't remember whether it was Tracy or Kelly. Profit is the lagging indicator. My lagging indicator is that Emily said something a year, and it took me a year ago. It took me a year to get to it. So,
It's okay. I practice patience. I try, Tracy.
It's definitely a masculine trait on my part.
Well, this has been amazing. I want to respect everyone's time, and we're so grateful, Kelly and Tracy. Thank you so much for taking your time and joining us, and for all of our guests for being part of this conversation and sharing your comments. And again, please join BIMA if you haven't, and we can continue the conversation we did record today, and we will post that in BIMA, and we'll send it out to you also if you have registered. So thank you all very much, and look forward to staying connected.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks for having us.
Right, good to see you. Bye.
Bye-bye.